It's been a wild 5 or so years for the pharmaceutical company Moderna. Before the pandemic hit in 2020, the Massachusetts-based company was considered the biggest startup in medicine, with billions in funding and nearly 1,000 employees. And all of this was riding on a product that was very promising but not yet approved, mRNA technology. I visited their Norwood, Mass campus back then and took a bunch of photos, which proved very useful because then, there was COVID. With billions of dollars in government funding, they had an mRNA vaccine out of the lab and into arms in an incredibly fast 11 months. This, of course, was good for business and for the emerging technology that is mRNA. By the way, the name Moderna, according to the company's website, literally combines the words modified and RNA, which happens to contain the word modern. So there was a lot of reason to believe that Moderna was poised to take the pharmaceutical industry by storm. But here we are in 2025, and that has not happened. In fact, Moderna's stock price has cratered 90%. So what the heck happened? That's the question my Stat colleague Jason Mast sought to answer in a recent deep dive into the company's history and current state. Last week, Jason and my new Stat colleague Damian Garde did a live virtual event discussing this story. Damian, when he was my old Stat colleague, wrote an early, comprehensive look at the company back in 2016. So these guys know they're Moderna. Soon, we'll hear what they have to say about the rise and fall of the company. But first, I have to share the most incredible story. Last week, James Watson died at 97. He was largely known for two things: for co-discovering the structure of DNA and for being an unbelievable racist and misogynist. A coworker of mine remarked that they would love to be able to read what Sharon would have written. That's because no one could write about a figure like Watson like Sharon Begley could. Sadly, Stat's beloved Sharon passed away almost 5 years ago. But in Stat's Friday afternoon editors meeting, an amazing discovery was made. So Gideon, could you take us inside the 3 p.m. editors meeting last Friday?
Yeah. So I had not yet heard that James Watson had died. And so in the course of the meeting, somebody brought it up. I can't remember whom. And I said, wait, what? James Watson died? And then the conversation went on to talk about, well, who can we get to write a piece about it? It must have been 5 or 10 seconds. And then this thought came into my head that, wait a minute, didn't Sharon maybe write an advance obit? An advance obit, for those who don't know, also I should say, is that something that news organizations have done forever, which is for very famous people, you prepare an obituary in advance so that it can be published as soon as the person dies. Actually, you conduct interviews with people to get their comments on the importance of their life, and et cetera, with the understanding it won't be published till they've passed away. So anyway, back to the story. I thought, wait a minute, didn't Sharon write an advance obit? And I just threw that out. And then our multimedia and photo director, Alyssa Ambrose, immediately went into our content management system, typed James Watson into the search, and there pops up this incredible remembrance of James Watson that Sharon had written. And actually on the top of it, it had a note that said Gideon edited, which I'd forgotten because it's been more than 5 years. So anyway, and everybody was just like stunned by it.
Yeah. I mentioned that one of our reporters said that as soon as she heard the news that Watson had passed, said that, I wish I could read what Sharon would write about this. What was it about Sharon's writing that was so uniquely suited to capturing a person like Watson?
She was had a style of writing that was where she had moral clarity, I think is what I'm trying to say in what she was writing. And given her knowledge, of science broadly, but particularly of coverage of James Watson, who she'd written about for many decades, was able to just cut through a lot of the debate about James Watson and get to the heart of who the man was in a way that I haven't seen anyone else do. She really kind of answered, there was this conundrum because he was considered one of the most famous scientists of the 20th century, but he also was an out-and-out racist and sexist, even though he actually helped advance the careers of a fair number of women. But there was this, so there was this conundrum: how can both of those things be in the same person? And because we sort of think, oh, well, a great scientist why, obviously there's no reason a great scientist can't be a racist or a sexist. In fact, many of them were, because there's a long history of eugenics. But anyway, Sharon was able to pull all of these threads together in this piece. And, I was, as only Sharon could. I think she just, yeah, she was a brilliant writer. And part of that brilliance was she was able to um, bring together coherently many different ideas and just cut through it all. And again, with moral clarity, just state what she thought. And, in a piece like this, a remembrance, you're able to say kind of a little bit, give more of your personal voice and opinion than you might in a news article. She also knew when she was writing this that she was dying. So I think she knew she was writing this for posterity.
Gideon, thanks so much. That was such a cool moment that we were able to do that on Friday. And I'm so glad you remembered it existed.
Yeah, you're welcome. Glad to join you.
Sharon was an incredible person. She's one of the greatest science writers of all time, but she was as kind as she was talented. We at Stat all miss her every day. And lastly, I just want to share a Blue Sky post from a reader. I'm glad that even if James Watson outlived Sharon Begley, he didn't outrun her. And before we get into the Moderna stuff, like always, if you're enjoying the video, please like and subscribe. It's a little click, but it's a big deal for us. All right, let's turn it over to Damian and Jason.
Jason, I'm delighted to talk to you about Moderna, a company that is very interesting. There's so many superlatives that apply to the company for its entire history. It was at one point the most valuable private biotech startup ever. It had the biggest ever biotech IPO ever. It helped literally save the world, which is maybe the biggest superlative applied to anyone. And now, in the years since, it has lost about 90% of its value since its peak. Your story begins at that peak, and we'll get to a lot of this in more detail, but I thought this might be a useful framing. The peak being 2021, when Moderna was on top of the world by virtue of helping save it with a COVID-19 vaccine that was, maybe most importantly for its business, printing money. And things have changed since then. So maybe in brief, what happened from peak Moderna 2021 to what we might call trough Moderna 2025?
Yeah, trough Moderna, I think is maybe not the term they want to catch on,
Sure.
but hopefully trough, and we'll see a rise from here. I mean, I'd say a few things happened. One was just like the market cooled down and like the stock came back a bit to earth into some of the fundamentals of the business. No one knew exactly how long COVID sales would last or what products would come, but I think it was safe to say that the market cap, which was I think 195 billion at its peak, something in that range, was not necessarily reflective of the fundamentals and more a reflection of sort of the moment we were in, but also of the promise that Moderna, that people believe Moderna had, and that like Stéphane Bancel and other folks in Moderna specifically pitched the world on. And so I'd say basically two things happened since then. One is that Moderna, or three things happened. One, vaccine sales did fall and fell faster, it seemed, than the company expected. Two, Moderna, to their credit, I suppose, spent a ton of money, all these billions of dollars, to back into R&D to churn out new vaccines, new products, new mRNA, everything basically. And that largely, I don't want to say it didn't work out, but like it has not worked out on the time frame that they hoped it would work out. And there are now no new blockbusters that have emerged from the pipeline. There is one new product outside of COVID. It made $2 million in sales in the last quarter per this morning's earnings. And then three, of course, which I don't, maybe someone who's much smarter than you or I or anyone in DC even could have prognosticated this by looking at the anti-vax wins, but no one, I think, could have predicted that RFK Jr. would become so powerful in American health policy, and that the company's flagship product and flagship technology would become basically like under attack from Washington. And so you have those three forces, and it does not then reflect well in the stock, at least.
Yeah, I mean, that's an incredible menu of things to go after for this company that is like, speaking of things that maybe they wouldn't really like themselves to be characterized, but has felt to me like this almost kind of like Forrest Gump entity in recent like biotech or even like medical or world history, which is to say that they emerged with this, as we mentioned, superlative funding early on at a time of zero interest rates, free money, high risk biotech being kind of en vogue, built themselves up with the promise of changing the world with mRNA, as everyone knows, and then ran into an issue of it seemed like mRNA was a really, really powerful and promising vaccine creation technology at a time when, at least in like the cynical world of how what gets invested in biotech more broadly, being a vaccine company didn't seem that attractive. It was perceived as a relatively low margin business that's patrolled largely by companies like GSK and Pfizer that have a scale that is just irreplicable by a small company like Moderna. And that, of course, leads to the once in 100 years event, or hopefully more sparsely replicated than that, of the COVID-19 pandemic, when suddenly the world really wanted companies that could quickly develop vaccines, and that leads to the peak you're talking about. And then in the, kind of monkey's paw curl back half of the Forrest Gump thing, then enter RFK, and suddenly being a company that is reliant on vaccines is one of the worst things that you can be in a policy environment in the United States. I did want to, or one thing from that menu that you laid out that I think is fascinating is zooming in again back in 2021 when the company's at its peak and it's making all this money. They're granted this almost like golden ticket that nobody ever gets to build whatever kind of company they want. They have capital, which, typically hard to get. They have what everybody knows is a temporary bolus of money. As you mentioned, like prognostications for how long the COVID vaccine revenue would keep up varied, but everybody understood like, okay, it's never going to be more than it is right now. And what Moderna chose to do in not purchase other firms, not diversify, not aspire to be the next Pfizer or even the next Biogen for that matter, but rather to invest internally in mRNA. And I wonder, I mean, you've reported on this, I'm sort of bearing the lead of your work. You've talked to people in and around this company all over this decision, this time period, all over. So you are uniquely seated to answer this question. How did they come to that decision to double down on what got them there rather than to pivot or diversify?
Yeah, and there is a lot of, I think, actually, I don't want to call it second guessing, although there is more of it now than there was. But people were saying at the time, hey, you should buy something with all this capital. And also not just the capital, but the fact that your stock is incredibly inflated and you could go out and use that stock to buy Intellia, to buy Alnylam, to buy these companies that are, even if you don't want to go and buy some or completely orthogonal business that is unrelated to what you do, is in the realm of nucleic acids, RNA, DNA, whatever that you can fit into your like pitch of like Moderna is an information molecule company, whatever that means. We can talk about like if that's sloganing or there's some realness to it. But they could have gone out and they could have bought, and there was like fear in some of these companies of like, oh, can we fend off a Moderna if they decide to buy us? There was also excitement in some of these companies of like, oh, we could become the next, we could like, have this big cash out. And what they decide to do instead is basically bet everything on mRNA. And, Stephen Hoag, who's the head of R&D there, was the head of R&D, now does oversee R&D, but at a higher level. There says like, look, we succeeded in COVID because we stuck to our knitting on being an mRNA company, even when we had all of these doubters in the press or wherever. And we were an mRNA company. We bet this all. We built this manufacturing plant that was with our limited resources that proved crucial during COVID. And so we're going to go and we're going to basically put all our eggs in this basket. And they seemed from the core to really believe that they were going to be able to then churn out this stream of medicines that's not just a COVID vaccine and not just vaccines, but other drugs as well. And what Stéphane Bancel would say was like, look, we knew from the beginning this was either going to be a zero drug company, because we're going to fail before we'll run out of money before we succeed, or it'll be a dozens and dozens of drugs company, because it's a platform and you can just swap out the mRNA. And they seem to really believe that. And so they put their eggs in the basket and they, ignored people who are treated with hostility, people who thought otherwise.
Yeah, that facet was fascinating. I thought from your story, the reporting that internally it wasn't just a matter of like peanut gallery things lobbed over a transom. The idea that Moderna might make different decisions with its, I don't want to call it a winning lottery ticket. They obviously invested and invented the vaccine, but it felt like a winning lottery ticket at the time. And that advice was not met terribly
And I should say,
positively.
like the most of the reporting is on the level of spending more so than the level of like, should we go out and buy like
Mm.
another company? But I can say, like, from the inside out, there was no real um no real discussion, it seemed, of buying another company or of going out, or at least of going out and buying something that is non-mRNA or non-mRNA adjacent.
Yeah. Well, and that was one aspect of your story that I thought was framed very well. I think it was Mani Forohar from Leerink who
Yeah.
described this as like the Shakespearean flaw or problem that Moderna has, which is that only this dogmatic and almost religious devotion to the promise of mRNA could have gotten them to that point they were at in 2021, where they've invented this vaccine, as you mentioned, have the manufacturing plant, have just made themselves an indispensable mRNA company at a time when the world just happens to really, really want some mRNA. But that same faith, that same dogmatic devotion made it such that they couldn't help but be Moderna.
It is possible that Moderna's norovirus vaccine succeeds and Moderna's combo flu COVID vaccine succeeds, and that Moderna's cancer vaccine all succeed and they end up looking better in the future. But so far, the disease-focused execution does look a little bit better.
And I wanted to also dig into in your reporting, like we've all witnessed Moderna's dramatic decline. We often frame these things through the context of the CEOs we see on TV and hear on earnings calls, et cetera. But I think one of the things that I thought was so illuminating about your story is that it was clearly drawn from talking to the people who were actually doing the work at Moderna. I don't mean to imply the executives don't work, but you know what I mean, employees. And so I wondered, what was their perspective on this dramatic rise and gradual fall, because they had done what, as you point out, and I think we've all heard from people involved in the COVID vaccine development programs, they'd done work that they felt like was the pinnacle of their careers, and then to witness how things went. So I don't know, what did you learn there?
Yeah, I mean, there were basically two stories that you heard from folks depending on their particular experience and, I don't know, I guess philosophy towards building a biotech. Is one was just like they went crazy and they had good science, but they went crazy and just thought the money would never end and they would be able to really churn out these new products in a way that was certainly now is obviously unrealistic, but could have been unrealistic. Could have been said to be unrealistic at the time. And you have people who said, look, we were very like we were doing the best work we could. We believed in the power of mRNA. We put all these products in development that could have and could still save a lot of lives. And a couple trials go differently, and you don't end up with RFK as the head of HHS, which is, as you point out, quite the as much of a Deus ex machina as the as COVID, saving the company. And you end up fine. Like, and the company's in a much different place. And so there were sort of those two dueling narratives. It was very much a place of great idealism for everyone, it seemed, in 2021 and 2022. And as far as the environment inside, it became, as things shifted, as money became tighter, as the demands on staff kept staying at the same incredibly high level that they were. Things got a little bit darker and grimmer and more stressful.
Yeah.
So there's sort of those two dueling narratives. I also say, like, one other thing that sort of came out of of those conversations is that Stefan Bancel is sort of known as the face of this company and the driver of this company, both of the culture and of that sprawling ambition. One of the things that was very interesting is that Stephen Hoag, who is a lot more, I guess, affable and like smiling and does a better interview. And I think, employees often speak very, very highly of and love working with him. And he's very clearly brilliant. Was one of the people who was most sort of possessive of that R&D budget and of not cutting any of that R&D budget. And so you will see some of that sort of, I don't know, inside the person who is most synonymous with the company isn't necessarily the person who even made the most consequential decision for where the company is today.
Mm. And that, I mean, through another lens, as you mentioned, if some of these trials had worked, we would be describing these same facts with a different intonation. And their commitment to investing in R&D, even if reasonable people can debate whether the profligacy of that spending was wise and whether the lack of diversification of that spending was wise. The other side of that coin is what drug companies are criticized for. And you point out in your story, they did do some stock buybacks, but by and large, and their executives are very well compensated, but by and large, this is a company that poured its profits into research, which is what its larger, I shouldn't even say rivals necessarily, but what larger pharmaceutical firms often pat themselves on the back for doing, even though they do it at a much smaller percentage of, excuse me, of their revenue than Moderna was doing. So, in fairness to them, they were ostensibly practicing what they preached. It just turned out that it's more difficult than perhaps it seemed. I did want to get to the Kennedy aspect because I feel like maybe we've gone too long without doing so because, as you point out, it's not just, shifting policy environments is something people talk about all the time, drug pricing, things come in and out, whatever. The United States appointed a guy to lead the health department, which regulates all of Moderna's products and any product that it will ever come up with, who has said in public, basically, products like Moderna's are killing people. And I mean, you can just pick and choose whatever statement from Kennedy that you feel like is most illustrative here, but is an avowed enemy of the company. I don't think it's unfair to say, and I think he would probably agree. How was that both the prospect of his ascension, his nomination, you have some of this in your story. This is something Moderna was conscious of and was scrambling to prepare for. What did they do in the time in which Kennedy's appointment seemed pending, and then also as the walls came down and he targeted mRNA for specific disinvestment and regulatory action?
Yeah, I mean, like on a larger level, there was actually not much they could do. There was nothing like Moderna was going to um, say or lobbyists that they were going to hire, although they have lobbyists, that was going to change that fact and who won the election and the bargain that like Trump had seemed to have made with Kennedy. There was nothing that was going to necessarily change that. So what they did was like they did a couple things. One, they like met with they had a town hall. They always have town halls, so it's not like this was Kennedy specific, but like people were nervous when it happened, and Kennedy very much came up, and they were like, or like at least the prospect, if not in name, came up, and he was like, "Look, we are going to stick to our science, and we've worked with other administrations in the past," and they sort of kept that going. There was a brief like to investors, they sometimes said, "Oh, he's more moderate than he maybe comes off. You look at some of his statements, he doesn't want to imperil vaccine access. We also don't." And then would later sort of talk about like, "Oh, focusing on the highest risk. We're also focused on the highest risk." The kinds of stuff that you might expect executives to say to make the best of the situation they're in. One of the things they did do behind the scenes was really scramble to get a contract done with BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Association at HHS, to make sure that they could make a avian flu vaccine because avian flu was and I believe still is ripping through farms across the country, even if we're not really paying attention to it anymore. And so that we'd be prepared. And they got that contract done on the last day of the Biden administration. And then, HHS tore apart that contract, and they replaced the ACIP. And so, I mean, like they tried to make the best of it. I'm not sure it ended up necessarily doing anything.
Yeah, I mean that aspect of it is fascinating and I mean, it makes for a very compelling dramatic twist in your story. It is obviously well, you pick an adjective for how you feel about that, but administrations are typically temporary. I wonder what is the last 10 years of Moderna have been like sui generis. I actually don't know how to pronounce that phrase. What do you imagine the next 10 years, what shape it might take? Because they're going through this chastening experience of having to slash their budget. They've said they may do it more. Their earnings were this morning. To the extent there was good news there, it was that they beat their earnings estimate, which is to say they took less of a loss than people thought because they cut so deeply. So, however you want to look at that, what's the plan going forward, and what are the potential outcomes for this company as they play out, I guess, the third act of this very interesting drama?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot will depend on the readout of the cancer vaccine, um, like trial that they have going, which I think can come as soon as next year, I think. Um, and that will change things dramatically one way or the other, quite likely. It could, if it fails, the company is definitely in quite a bit of trouble. If it succeeds, depending on the level of success, um, you know, Bancel, I believe, has talked about this as the next Keytruda. Like, if it succeeds across these number of different indications, maybe you're looking at a very different company. That's all, hypothetical, trial depending, and all of that. I will say, like, there is actually a good argument to be made that, like, Kennedy has not actually had that great of an impact on the company. An avian flu vaccine is not something that is going to, it is a thing that, like, as a nation, it would be great to have because pandemics are bad. And like, mRNA is a really good platform for preparing vaccines for them. But it's not like this was going to be a major moneymaker for Moderna, barring a pandemic. And then you look and it would have been a real issue for Moderna to come up to the ACIP that has now been replaced by Kennedy with people who are, let's say, many of them are skeptical of the traditional things that public health folks say about vaccines and the data on vaccines. If they had been still investing in infectious disease and planned to put forward their CMV vaccine, but the CMV vaccine failed. A lot of the other investments in ID have been somewhat scaled back. It could still be an issue as they bring forward, as they look for better recommendations for their like RSV vaccine and for the combo shots. But there is an argument to be made that like the RFK specifically hasn't had a big impact, but the politics as a whole that have made COVID vaccines a little bit radioactive and or at least a little bit divided on how we view them, and not the same way as flu, which I think Poncel has made a good argument that we should look at them similar to flu and take them like on levels similar to flu, and maybe we would in a world that wasn't, again, so politically charged post-COVID. That has had actually a bigger impact than RFK specifically. But as it goes for the future of the company, I mean, again, a lot's going to depend on that trial. A lot will depend on, if they can successfully get this this flu COVID combo across the finish line, and if people will actually take it. They've got some rare disease trials that are ongoing, and could change things, although it's unclear how applicable that is outside of those couple small indications. And they are, as we report in the story, they have been talking to buyers or to people who, at least for some kind of large partnership, or at least one person for one large partnership. So there is a few different branches. They do have $6 billion, actually more than $6 billion in the bank at the end of this year as of the earnings today. So they've got a bit of runway. They've said they're willing to cut, it seems. So I think they're in it.
Jason, thank you again for taking the time. You can find Jason's full account and the story that we've been talking about on our website. Hopefully you read it before now, but if not, what an advertisement.
Thanks again to Jason and Damian. That was a fascinating chat. And if you like this video, again, please like and subscribe. It's a little click, but it's a big deal for us. And we'll be back next week. Same stat time, same stat channel.